She was just a waitress in the eyes of everyone, a girl who carried trays and cleared glasses, moving quietly between the tables with a polite smile. She wore a plain black uniform with a white apron, and nothing about her seemed different from the other staff working that night. But behind her calm face there was a world no one could see, a dream that she had carried in her heart since she was a child. Every evening, after finishing her shift, she would walk home through the quiet streets, her feet aching from standing all day. But when she reached her tiny apartment, her face would light up. There was an old piano in the corner, scratched and slightly broken, but it was her treasure. It had belonged to a neighbor who had moved away and left it behind. And when she pressed the keys, no matter how tired she was, the world around her changed. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was an artist pouring her soul into music. Still, no one in her workplace knew this about her. To them, she was the quiet one, always working hard, never complaining, and never drawing attention. The guests at the gala never looked at her twice. They were too busy talking about money, politics, or fashion to them. She was invisible, just part of the background, and she accepted that role with patience, though deep inside, she wondered if life would ever give her a chance to show the world what she truly was. The gala nights were the hardest for her, because that was when the piano was brought into the hall, polished until it gleamed under the golden lights. She always looked at it when she passed by, carrying drinks or plates, and every time, her heart would ache a little. She imagined sitting there, her hands moving over the keys, filling the room with melodies that could make people smile, cry, or dream. But it was just imagination, and she knew better than to believe such a moment would ever come. Her childhood had been simple. She grew up in a small town where money was always short, but joy was found in small things. Her father loved music, and he used to hum while fixing things around the house. One day, when she was about 7, she found an old keyboard at a flea market. The keys were yellow and half of them didn't even work, but she begged her mother to buy it, and that was where her journey began. Every night she would sit for hours, teaching herself songs by listening and repeating. While her friends played outside, she pressed the keys over and over until the notes sounded right. Years later, when life became harder and she had to work to support herself, her dream of becoming a pianist faded into the background. It became like a secret garden she could only visit when she was alone. But that garden kept her spirit alive, even when everything else felt heavy. And though the world only saw her as a waitress, she still held on to the quiet hope that maybe, one day, fate would surprise her. On that particular evening, as she served at the luxurious gala, she felt the same familiar pull toward the piano. It stood in the corner, shining under the chandelier, waiting for the professional pianist who was supposed to arrive later. She tried not to stare at it too much, afraid someone might notice her longing eyes, but she couldn't help herself. She imagined the keys under her fingers, the sound rising above the clinking glasses and shallow laughter, changing the whole mood of the room. But when she carried a tray past the table of businessmen, she overheard their dismissive jokes about the staff, about how waiters and waitresses were born to serve, not to shine. She lowered her eyes and walked faster, pretending she didn't hear. But inside, her heart whispered, if only they knew. If only they could hear what I can do. And yet she also feared the idea, because if she ever tried and failed, their laughter would crush her forever. The night was still young. The guests kept arriving in sparkling gowns and expensive suits, their perfumes filling the air, their laughter echoing through the decorated hall. She moved carefully among them, balancing plates with grace, but with each passing moment, her thoughts returned to the piano, her secret companion, the one object in the entire room that understood her soul. And though she stayed silent and unseen, the story of her hidden brilliance was only waiting for the right moment to be told. Little did she know, that night would not end as any other night. She had no idea that fate had already chosen her, and that before the evening was over, the entire elite crowd would see her not as a waitress but as something far greater, as someone who could touch hearts with the power of music. The gala was no ordinary dinner. It was the kind of evening where chandeliers sparkled like stars, and the carpets were so soft they almost swallowed the sound of footsteps. The walls were draped in velvet and golden lights reflected from crystal glasses. Every detail had been arranged to show wealth and power, the kind of scene that ordinary people only saw in movies. Expensive cars lined up outside the grand hall, each one dropping off guests dressed in the most elegant clothes, women in shimmering gowns with jewels around their necks, men in tailored suits that spoke of luxury and class. Photographers stood near the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone famous, and reporters whispered about who might attend. It was an evening for the elite, the ones who believed the world belonged to them inside. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. The guests spoke about business deals, vacations in faraway countries, and the latest news in politics. They shook hands and exchanged smiles that looked polite but never too genuine. It was a place where everyone wanted to be seen, where image mattered more than truth, and where no one noticed the people serving them. The waiters and waitresses moved quietly, carrying silver trays with wine, cocktails, and sparkling water. They weaved through the crowd like shadows, always polite, never intruding. The young waitress was among them, her steps careful, her face calm, her hands steady, though her eyes kept wandering toward the grand piano standing proudly in one corner of the hall, covered with a glossy finish that reflected the lights above. To her it wasn't just furniture. It was a voice waiting to be heard. But for now the piano stood silent, reserved for the professional performer who had been invited to entertain the guests. Everyone expected a perfect performance later in the evening, something to match the glamour of the event. The organizers had promised music that would charm the crowd and keep the atmosphere alive. It was all part of the show, all part of impressing the guests. The young waitress passed by tables decorated with tall flower arrangements and shining silver cutlery. She heard pieces of conversations, some about money lost in business, some about new projects, some about who was richer than whom. She felt invisible, just a worker in black and white uniform among a sea of glittering clothes. She had served in many events before, but this one felt heavier, as if the pressure of perfection was floating in the air. On the stage, a host with a charming smile welcomed everyone, thanking them for coming. His voice boomed through the microphone, announcing the importance of the evening. People clapped politely, and then returned to their private discussions. The music in the background was light and soft, just enough to keep the room from falling silent, but not enough to draw attention. All the attention was on wealth, appearances, and power. The young waitress walked past the piano again, her heart giving a small ache. She wondered how it would feel to sit on that stool, under the lights with hundreds of eyes watching. She wondered if her hands would tremble or if her soul would guide her to play as freely as she did in her apartment. She shook the thought away quickly. It was foolish. This was not her world. This was their world, and she was only there to serve. As the evening moved forward, the air grew warmer with the mix of perfumes, laughter, and the sound of glasses clinking. The piano still waited in silence, and the crowd continued to fill the hall. It felt like a movie scene about pride and power. But beneath all that shine and glitter, a quiet story was waiting to be born. A story no one could have predicted. The guests were excited about the program. Some asked when the pianist would arrive. Others leaned back in their chairs, expecting a flawless performance to match their flawless evening. But fate had something else planned. Something far more powerful than they could imagine. Something that would remind them that talent and brilliance were not owned by money or position. And so the grand event continued, building like a stage set for destiny, the room full of important people unaware that the real star of the evening was not among them, not dressed in diamonds or silk, but quietly carrying trays and wearing a plain black uniform, waiting for the moment when her hidden world would collide with theirs. The evening was moving smoothly, or at least it seemed that way on the surface. The guests were enjoying their drinks, the waiters were serving dishes, and the host kept the mood alive with polite announcements, but behind the scenes, there was a growing tension. The pianist, the one who had been hired to entertain the elite crowd, had not arrived. At first, the organizers tried to stay calm. They whispered to each other and checked their phones, sending messages and making quick calls. Maybe the pianist was just late, maybe the traffic was bad, maybe he was already on his way. But as the minutes passed, their smiles became tight, their voices sharper. The crowd had started asking questions. When would the performance begin? Where was the music they had been promised? The piano stood at the edge of the hall, gleaming under the lights, almost mocking them with its silence. The guests looked at it from time to time, some tapping their fingers impatiently on the table, others joking that perhaps someone from the crowd should take the seat. Laughter rippled through the hall, but underneath the laughter was annoyance. This was supposed to be a perfect evening, and perfection was slipping away. The young waitress noticed the worried faces of the event managers. She saw how they kept glancing at the doors, hoping to see the pianist walk in. She also noticed how the guests were growing restless, shifting in their chairs, whispering to each other. Her heart beat a little faster. She knew exactly what the problem was, and she knew that if she dared, she could solve it. But she pushed the thought away. What chance did she have? She was just a waitress. No one would ever let her touch the grand piano. not in front of such an important crowd. Still, her eyes kept returning to it. Her hands itched to play. She could almost hear the notes in her head, beautiful melodies flowing into the restless air, calming it, transforming it. Then, in the middle of the chaos, someone from the staff laughed nervously and said, "Why not let her try? She's always staring at the piano anyway." The words were not meant to be serious, just a careless joke to ease the tension, but they reached the ears of the nearby guests and soon the laughter spread. The idea of a waitress playing the piano was amusing to them. Ridiculous even. One of the guests, a man in a sharp suit, smirked and said loudly, "Yes, why not? Let's see what the little waitress can do." His words made others chuckle, and soon the entire table was joining in. Some clapped their hands mockingly, others whistled, encouraging her to step forward. But their encouragement was not kind. It was full of arrogance, the kind of amusement that comes from believing in someone's failure before they even try. The young waitress froze. Her face flushed. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to pretend she hadn't heard. But now all eyes were on her. She looked at her fellow staff members, hoping they would defend her. But they only gave her helpless looks. No one wanted to get in trouble with the guests. The event manager, desperate to fix the situation, gave a weak laugh and said, "Well, maybe just for a moment." Until the real pianist arrives, his voice was uncertain, but he had no other choice. The restless crowd was demanding entertainment, and if giving them a show, even a silly one, kept them calm, then so be it. The waitress's heart raced. She shook her head quickly, trying to step back. But the crowd kept pushing with their voices. "Go on," they said. "Show us what you've got." Their laughter rang in her ears. Some faces looked curious, others mocking. It felt like the whole world was daring her to humiliate herself. She walked slowly toward the piano, her hands trembling, her steps heavy. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the voices around her. She wanted to run away, but something deep inside told her not to. This was the chance she had dreamed of, even if it came wrapped in mockery, even if it came at the cost of failure. It was still a chance. As she reached the piano, she touched the polished surface lightly. Almost as if asking it for courage, the stool stood waiting. The keys glowed under the lights. She sat down slowly, the crowd murmuring and chuckling behind her. She took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered above the keys, the same way they had thousands of times in her tiny apartment. For a moment, everything felt still. Her fear, her doubts, the laughter of the guests all melted away. All that remained was her and the piano. She closed her eyes for a second and told herself, "This is it. This is the moment I was waiting for." And so, with a heart full of fear and hope, she pressed the first key, sending the very first note into the air, a note that would change the entire evening. The moment she sat at the piano, the hall seemed to shift, but not in her favor. Whispers rose like waves through the crowd. Some people leaned closer to their friends, smirking as if they were about to watch a comedy. Others crossed their arms and leaned back in their chairs, ready to be entertained by her failure. The atmosphere was heavy with doubt. From the back, a woman in a glittering dress chuckled softly. Covering her mouth with her hand, she whispered to her companion, "A waitress playing the piano. What's next? The chef singing opera." Her words made the man beside her laugh, and the sound reached the waitress's ears, cutting her heart like a blade. Another man, older, with gray hair and sharp eyes, shook his head with clear disapproval. "This is a waste of time," he muttered loudly enough for others to hear. "A grand event like this deserves professionals, not foolish experiments." His voice carried authority, and several nodded in agreement. The young waitress could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. The polished surface reflected her nervous face. Her breathing grew shallow. She wondered if she should stand up and leave, if she should save herself from the humiliation that seemed certain, but her body stayed frozen. Caught between fear and courage at another table, a group of younger guests laughed openly. One of them clapped mockingly and said, "Come on, little pianist, show us your magic. We are waiting." His tone was sharp, dripping with sarcasm. His friends joined in with whistles and light applause, their eyes shining with cruel amusement. The event manager, standing near the side, looked both embarrassed and worried. He had agreed to let her play just to calm the guests, but now he feared the decision might make things worse. He hoped desperately that the real pianist would arrive any second, so this awkward performance could end quickly. The waitress closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to block out the noise. She remembered the sound of her small apartment, the way silence filled the room before she began to play. She tried to imagine she was there, alone with no mocking eyes, no cruel whispers, only her and the piano. But the sound of laughter pulled her back, reminding her that this was not her safe space. This was a battlefield. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, but she didn't press them yet. She hesitated, her mind screaming that she would fail, that they would laugh harder once she began. She could almost hear it, the sound of their laughter drowning her music, the sound of her own heart breaking. Someone from the front row leaned forward and said in a loud voice, "Hurry up, girl. We don't have all night." His impatience sparked another ripple of laughter. It felt like the entire hall was against her, like she was standing on a stage built for her humiliation. In that moment, she thought about walking away. She thought about standing up and saying, "I can't do this," and disappearing into the kitchen where no one could see her tears. But another thought stopped her, a memory of her father humming while fixing things, of her childhood self practicing on broken keys, of all the nights she had spent teaching herself, when no one clapped, when no one cared. Yet she still played because music was part of her soul. Her heart whispered, "If you walk away now, you will never forgive yourself. They will laugh, yes, but at least let them laugh after hearing you. Not before, at least let the music speak once, even if they don't listen." She opened her eyes slowly, her fear still there but mixed now with something stronger, a quiet determination. She glanced at the guests who stared at her with mocking smiles, and for the first time she didn't lower her eyes. She let her fingers rest firmly on the keys, the cold smoothness grounding her, giving her strength. The crowd still buzzed with doubt, some whispering, some laughing, some already bored. No one believed in her. But perhaps that was the secret gift of the moment. With no expectations, she had nothing to lose, and everything to prove. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly, her mind repeating silently, "Play, just play. Don't think of them. Don't think of their laughter. Think of the piano. Think of the music. Think of the little girl who once dreamed of this moment." And then, in the middle of doubt, mockery, and cruel laughter, she pressed the first note, soft and trembling, but filled with the beginning of something no one in the room expected. Her fingers touched the keys, and the first note echoed through the hall. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like a whisper that wasn't sure if anyone was listening. But even that single note had a purity to it, a sound that carried something deep, something honest. The laughter around her began to fade for just a second, as if people were surprised by how clear it sounded. She pressed another key, then another, and soon a gentle melody began to form. Her hands trembled slightly, but the moment the music flowed, her fear started to melt. The piano was no longer a stranger. It was an old friend, welcoming her back. Her heart raced, but her fingers remembered the countless nights she had played in her little apartment. They knew what to do. At first, some guests still chuckled, expecting her to make mistakes. One man leaned back and muttered, "She'll stumble any second now." But as the melody grew stronger, even he turned his head to listen. The notes carried across the hall like a soft breeze, weaving between the tables, filling the space with something that felt almost magical. The waitress's eyes softened. She was no longer looking at the people. She wasn't even aware of their stares. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her soul guide her fingers. The music rose and fell like a story, telling of sorrow, hope, and dreams hidden away. She wasn't just playing notes. She was sharing pieces of her life. The crowd slowly began to change. The restless murmurs quieted, the smirks faded, heads turned toward the stage. It was as if the room itself had taken a breath and was now holding it, waiting for more. Those who had mocked her now leaned forward slightly, their eyes fixed on the girl they had dismissed only moments before. She played with a mix of nervous energy and raw passion, her body swaying gently with the rhythm, her hands moving faster now. More confidently, the melody lifted higher, echoing off the golden walls of the hall. The chandeliers glittered above her as if sparkling in time with the music. In one corner, a woman who had been whispering cruel jokes earlier now stared in silence, her eyes glistening. She hadn't expected to feel something so deep from a girl in a plain uniform. Another man, who had scoffed at the idea of her playing, now tapped his finger gently on the table, following the rhythm without realizing it. The transformation had begun. The waitress felt the change too. She could sense the room growing still. She could feel the doubt in the air being replaced with wonder. It gave her more courage. Her fingers flew across the keys with greater strength. The music poured out of her like a river finally breaking free. She forgot her fear. She forgot the mockery. She forgot she was just a waitress in their eyes. In that moment, she was exactly who she was meant to be. A pianist, an artist, Every note seemed to touch something hidden in the hearts of the people, reminding them of feelings they had long buried. Some thought of their own childhood dreams. Others remembered lost loves. Some felt a peace they hadn't felt in years. The music was not just sound, it was emotion, and it spoke louder than any words ever could. She shifted into a softer passage, the melody slowing, her fingers caressing the keys gently. The hall fell completely silent. No one whispered. No one laughed. The only sound was her music, echoing like a story too powerful to ignore. Even the servers carrying trays stopped for a moment, holding their breath as they listened. The young waitress felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from relief, from joy, from the realization that this moment was real. She was playing in front of people who had doubted her, and instead of failure, she had found freedom. She had silenced them, not with anger, not with words, but with music. The melody grew again, rising toward its peak, her hands dancing across the keys. The room seemed to glow brighter, as if the piano itself had become the center of the universe. She poured every hidden part of herself into the sound, the pain of being unseen, the longing to be heard, the quiet hope she had carried for years. It all came out in those notes. By the time she reached the final sequence, the crowd was no longer an audience of skeptics. They were captives of her brilliance, their eyes wide, their hearts open. Waiting for every note, she slowed her pace, letting the last few tones linger in the air, soft and delicate until finally, the last note hung for a moment and then faded into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The hall was wrapped in stillness as if time itself had paused. She kept her hands resting on the keys, afraid to break the fragile magic that had filled the room. And then, just as her chest began to ache from holding her breath, a sound came, the sound of hands clapping. Slowly at first, then faster, then louder, until the entire hall erupted in applause. The moment her music filled the hall, everything began to change. The laughter that had once echoed across the tables faded away. The sharp whispers of doubt grew silent, and all that remained was the sound of her fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The crowd that had been restless only minutes before now sat still, their eyes fixed on the waitress they had mocked. It was as if a spell had been cast. The grand chandeliers seemed to shine brighter. The golden walls of the hall seemed warmer, and even the air felt different. The music carried a kind of magic that touched every person present, no matter how rich or powerful they thought they were. For the first time that evening, they were not thinking about their businesses, their money, or their clothes. They were simply listening. Some of the guests leaned forward without realizing it, their earlier smirks replaced with wide eyes. They had expected clumsy mistakes, harsh sounds, or nervous fumbling. Instead, they were given beauty, honesty, and passion. One woman who had earlier joked about the waitress now felt her throat tighten. She pressed her hand to her chest as the melody reminded her of a childhood dream she had abandoned long ago. At another table, a man who had scoffed at the idea of her playing now sat completely still, the corners of his mouth softening as he realized the power of her performance. He could feel emotions rising in him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Even the younger guests, who had laughed the loudest, now sat in silence, their faces glowing with surprise. The transformation was not only in the guests, it was in the waitress too. The girl who had walked to the piano trembling with fear was gone. In her place was a pianist full of confidence. Her hands no longer shook. Her back was straight, her face calm. She moved with the natural grace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She no longer looked like a servant. She looked like an artist commanding the room. The staff who had worked beside her every day also stood in awe. They had never known her secret. They had never guessed that beneath her quiet nature lived such a powerful gift. Some of them stopped moving, holding trays in their hands as they watched her play, proud and stunned at the same time. It was as though they were seeing her for the first time. The melody she played seemed to change the very air. At times it was soft and tender, making people close their eyes and drift into memories. At times it was strong and powerful, sending shivers down their spines. She guided them on a journey without speaking a single word. Every rise and fall in the music pulled at their hearts. Every pause made them lean in closer. One guest whispered softly, almost to himself, "How can this be?" His voice was full of wonder. Another guest nodded, unable to find words. For the first time in a long while, the elite crowd was united not by status or wealth, but by emotion. They were all listening to the same story told through her music, and each one of them felt it in their own way. The waitress herself could feel the shift. She no longer felt the weight of their judgment. Instead, she felt their energy feeding her courage. The silence in the room was not heavy with doubt anymore. It was filled with awe, and that gave her wings. She played with even more passion, letting her soul pour into every note. Her eyes glistened with quiet tears, not of sadness but of release. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now that it had come, it was even more powerful than she had imagined. The very people who had mocked her were now her audience. Her believers. They had no choice because the truth of her talent was undeniable. As the melody slowed into a gentle passage, the guests leaned even closer, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles they didn't realize had formed. The transformation of the room was complete. The divide between the elite and the waitress had disappeared in that moment. They were all simply human, sharing the same experience, touched by the same beauty. The chandeliers above flickered as if bowing to her music. The polished floors reflected the light and the movement of her hands. The hall itself seemed to glow with life, no longer just a place of wealth and pride, but a place where something real, something unforgettable had been born. The young waitress could feel her heart soaring. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't overlooked. She wasn't just part of the background. She was the center, the light, the reason the entire room was silent. And though she had entered the stage with doubt and fear, she now sat there with strength as if she had always belonged. By the time her hands reached the end of the melody, the room had been completely transformed. The people, the mood, the very air itself, all had shifted because of her music, and, though she did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of the story that would change her life forever. The final note of her song floated into the air and lingered like a delicate feather. It hung in the silence of the grand hall, refusing to leave, and for one long breath, the world seemed to stop. Her fingers rested on the keys. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart still racing from the storm of music she had just released. The hall was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was not the silence of doubt anymore. It was the silence of awe, of people who had been caught unprepared by something far greater than their expectations. The waitress looked down, afraid to lift her eyes, afraid that maybe the silence meant failure, that maybe they still doubted her. But then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, came the sound of clapping. It was soft at first, a single pair of hands, then another joined and another until the sound spread like fire. Suddenly the hall was filled with thunderous applause, louder and louder with each passing second. The silence had broken into a storm of admiration. The waitress lifted her head slowly. Her eyes wide, she saw the crowd on their feet. People who had mocked her were now standing, clapping until their palms turned red. Some whistled, some shouted words of praise. The grand hall shook with the force of their reaction. The same elite crowd that had doubted her now cheered for her as if she were a star. Tears stung her eyes. She couldn't stop them even if she tried. Her vision blurred as she looked at the sea of faces, no longer cold and arrogant but shining with admiration. Some had tears running down their cheeks. Others smiled with warmth. The transformation was complete. The same people who had looked at her as a servant now looked at her as an artist. One man in a sharp suit, who had earlier laughed the loudest, was now clapping the hardest, his face red with emotion. He leaned toward the person beside him and said, "I have never heard anything so beautiful." His voice was sincere, almost trembling nearby. A woman in a diamond necklace wiped her eyes, whispering. She played with her soul, not just her hands. The applause did not stop. It grew louder, echoing against the golden walls, shaking the chandeliers above. It was the kind of applause that comes not from politeness, but from hearts that had been touched. It was raw, real, unstoppable. The waitress stood slowly, her knees weak, her hands trembling. She gave a small bow, unsure how to react. The clapping only grew louder, the sound of hundreds of hands honoring her brilliance. She had dreamed of this moment but never truly believed it would come, and now it was here, overwhelming her completely. The staff standing at the edges of the hall looked at each other in disbelief. They clapped too, pride glowing in their eyes. They had worked beside her every day, never knowing the treasure she carried within her. Now they were proud to call her one of their own. The applause stretched on, minute after minute. No one wanted to stop. No one wanted the moment to end. It was as if the entire hall wanted to give back to her what she had given them through her music. For those few minutes, she was not a waitress, not a servant, not invisible. She was the star, the reason the night would be remembered. She looked around the hall at the faces of the elite and realized something powerful. They were not clapping for her uniform, or her status, or her background. They were clapping for her gift, for her courage, for her heart. Music had erased the walls between them, and for once they were all the same. Her tears finally fell. running down her cheeks as she bowed again. She wanted to speak to thank them, but no words came. Her voice was lost in the flood of emotion, but it didn't matter, because her music had already said everything that needed to be said. The host, who had been so confident earlier, stood at the side with his mouth open in shock. He had expected a disaster, but instead he had witnessed a miracle when the applause became too powerful to ignore. He stepped forward, raising his voice over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight we have all witnessed something extraordinary." The audience roared even louder, agreeing with his every word. For the young waitress, this was more than applause. It was a moment that proved her life could be different, that her dreams were not foolish, that her hidden brilliance could shine in the brightest of places. The sound of their clapping filled her with strength she had never felt before, and so she stood there, trembling but proud, her heart soaring higher than it ever had, the thunderous applause washing over her again and again, reminding her that sometimes fate reveals brilliance when no one expects it, and that one brave moment can change everything forever. The night did not end when the music stopped. In fact, that was when the real story began. The thunderous applause slowly settled into murmurs of amazement. People leaned across their tables, speaking about the waitress as if she were no longer one of the staff but a star who had just been born. Her name spread from one mouth to another, whispered like a secret treasure that had been hidden in plain sight. Some of the most powerful guests rushed to meet her. Men and women who had once ignored her now stood in line to shake her hand, their voices full of praise. "You were extraordinary," one said. "That was the most moving performance I've ever heard," another added. The young waitress bowed her head shyly, still overwhelmed, still unable to believe that this was real. The event manager, who had been nervous and embarrassed earlier, now looked at her with pride and relief, his hands trembling as he clapped her shoulder and said, "You saved the night." He knew that the gala would be remembered not for its wealth or glamour, but for the moment a waitress turned into an artist before their eyes. Reporters who had come to write about the elite gathering now scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing, capturing the girl at the piano, capturing her shy smile and teary eyes. One journalist whispered, "This will be the headline tomorrow." And indeed it was by the next morning. Newspapers and online articles carried her story everywhere. The news spread like wildfire. People all over the city read about the waitress who stunned the elite crowd. Some were inspired, others curious. Videos recorded on phones at the gala began to circulate. Millions watched her performance, and soon the whole nation was talking about her. She became a symbol of hidden brilliance, a reminder that talent can be found in the most unexpected places. At her workplace, everything changed. Her fellow waiters and waitresses looked at her with new respect. No longer just the quiet girl who carried trays, she was someone extraordinary. Customers who returned to the restaurant whispered about her. Some even asked to meet her. Her life, which had been simple and unnoticed, now shone with possibilities. Opportunities began to open. Musicians, agents, and teachers reached out. Some offered to train her professionally. Others wanted her to perform on bigger stages. She was invited to play at charity events, concerts, and gatherings far beyond anything she had imagined. Her world, once small and limited, expanded overnight. But the greatest change was not in how the world saw her. It was in how she saw herself. For years she had hidden her gift, afraid it would never be accepted, afraid it would never be enough. But that night proved to her that her dream was real, that her music had power, that her voice mattered. She carried that knowledge like a flame in her heart, giving her strength and courage to step into a new life. People who had been at the gala told the story again and again. "I was there," they said proudly. "I saw her play." It became a tale shared across dinner tables and offices. The night when a simple waitress revealed brilliance and silenced the arrogance of an entire elite crowd. It was remembered not as a night of wealth, but as a night of humility, beauty, and truth. Some guests even admitted their shame. They confessed how they had mocked her, how they had doubted her, and how wrong they had been. Their hearts changed because of her music, and they carried that lesson with them, reminding themselves never to judge so quickly, never to underestimate someone just because of their position. The waitress herself remained humble, even as her name grew. Even as she stepped onto bigger stages, she never forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the long nights in her small apartment with the broken piano. She carried gratitude for every moment, for every listener, for every chance to play. Her humility only made people love her more. Years later, people still remembered that gala. Not for the luxury, not for the expensive dresses, not for the business deals, but for the moment a young waitress sat at the piano and changed the atmosphere of an entire room. It became a story told to inspire children, artists, and dreamers. A reminder that brilliance can shine anywhere and that sometimes, all it takes is one brave moment to reveal it. And so, the waitress who once carried trays became a symbol of hope. Her music continued to touch hearts, and the legacy of that night lived on. It was the night when silence turned to thunderous applause, when doubt turned to admiration, and when an ordinary girl showed the world the extraordinary truth hidden within her soul.